Welcome to Design Domination, where you'll learn to become a better, more business-savvy designer so you can dominate your competition. Hi, and thanks for tuning in. I'm Colleen Grotzer, and in this episode of Design Domination, I talk all about paper. When you design for print, are you neglecting paper choice in the process? Do you leave that paper choice to the client or the printer? If so, that means that you may not be making necessary color adjustments for different types of papers. And that can result in an unsightly and a costly error. But it also means that you're missing out on such a cool part of the design process. Stay tuned to find out about the different types of paper and finishes, what to consider when using them, and some ways that you can incorporate them into the design process for added creativity. I absolutely love paper. I love talking about paper. I love selecting paper. I love looking at the color and texture options. I love smelling paper, preferably in a fresh stack or after it's been delivered from the printer and has a varnish on it. I'll take print over a digital document any day. Now, some people don't think so, but print is still important in today's world. It's often used as a tool to drive traffic to a website. It gives the customer something to have in hand as a reminder of their business. And paper choice is a crucial aspect of this, and I feel like this is a dying art. I really miss the days when clients printed so much in 2-spot colors, because then 4-color process printing was much more expensive. We didn't have digital printing, and in the quality that we do now, that makes it much cheaper to print in 4-color process. So we designers had to be super creative back then to find ways to produce print pieces that didn't break the bank, but still had big impact. Personally, I did a lot with spot colors, including mixing them in Quark Express or in individual channels in Photoshop in what's called DCS format. I know some of my old school peeps will get what I mean by that. And depending on the 2 colors I chose, I could get really close to achieving the appearance of full color. I used to do a lot with colored and textured papers to add color to the piece since it only had 1 or 2 colors. And I'd often choose a metallic or a day glow ink for one of the spot colors. It was so much fun. In fact, if you're interested, check out the episode page to see some of my work from back in those days, in the 90s, to see what I'm talking about. Okay, so let's start out talking about different types of paper stock, coated and uncoated. Okay, so the first is coated. Coated paper stock has been coated with a surface sealant, and that contributes to its degree of gloss and smoothness. Coated paper stock can be coated on one side only, called C1S, or it can be coated on both sides, known as C2S, coated 2 sides. C1S would be good for book covers where the inside covers do not print. They would be blank, in other words. It would also be a good choice for a postcard to give you one side where the design would be the focus, while allowing for the uncoated side to be used for hand addressing or inkjetting of an address. And we'll get into that more later. Coated paper stock is available in several finishes. The first is gloss. Gloss paper has the most sheen to it. And gloss has less ink absorption, so the colors appear really vibrant. Now, some gloss papers are available in a high or like a super gloss, and then gloss or semi-gloss finish. The caveat to gloss paper stocks is that they reflect a lot of light, so they don't make a great choice for some audiences, such as older ones, and then certain types of print pieces or ones that have a lot of text, as they can make them harder to read. Another finish is satin. Satin paper has a less shiny finish, so it's not as shiny as gloss. And then matte coated paper, which is not glossy and has very little sheen. And then there's dull, which is paper with a dull finish and a smooth feel, but it's low on gloss. And another one, and this is one of my faves, is metallic. Metallic finishes are so cool. They are really great for getting attention, especially if something is mailed in a metallic envelope. Just like with Pantone inks, there are so many colors of metallic papers to choose from. So let's get into some things to know and to consider with coated papers. Okay, so coated papers have reduced ink absorbency, and so that means that the ink sits on the surface of the paper. And like I said earlier with the gloss, that also makes the colors appear more vibrant as a result. Anything that's printed on coated paper that's going to be handled should have a coating or a varnish to prevent smudging. And that could be, a book or a brochure cover, or it could be like a pocket guide map piece, just to give you a few examples. If you want to use a metallic or a day glow spot color, which I love, you'll want to choose coated paper stock if you want the metallic to be shiny and the day glow to be vibrant. Now, the caveat to some coated papers, usually high gloss, is that they don't allow for someone to write on the sheet at all or easily. And if they do allow for that, the ink might smudge. So in those cases, those papers are not a good choice for forms or for pages that you'd want someone to be able to, write notes on. Some coated paper stocks also aren't good for anything that would need ink jetting, such as postcards or other self-mailers where mail houses need to print the addresses directly on them. In those cases, though, ink jetting could be done on a label and then applied to the finished piece. Some coated paper stocks could also be a problem if a client needs to print something through their office printer. That could be something that gets printed commercially first, like letterhead, or it's only going to be printed on the client's office printer, like if they want to print a name and or address on something, and that might smudge going through their printer. Other than going with an uncoated paper instead, you could potentially go with a C1S. Again, that's coated one side. Now onto uncoated. Uncoated paper stock has not been coated with a surface sealant, so there is no sheen. The ink gets absorbed into the paper and to varying degrees based on the paper. And as a result, colors will appear duller or darker than they would on a coated sheet. Uncoated papers are also available in a variety of finishes, and I'll go into some of them. Smooth is one, and there are even several types of smooth finishes, and I'll go into some of those. The first one is wove. Wove paper is slightly textured, but mostly smooth. And then next is smooth. Smooth papers have a very smooth surface. Then there's vellum. Vellum finish is smooth, but has an eggshell feel. Then there's also writing paper stock, and that is often used for letterhead. Newsprint is used for newspapers. And as you know, it's super thin and cheap, and it totally soaks up ink like a sponge. Now, there are several types of textured finishes too, another of my faves. And these have visual textures, but also tactile textures when you touch them. The first one is laid. Laid paper has textured lines on the surface, like a grid, and you often see that used for letterhead, envelopes, and business cards. And then linen, which you've probably seen quite a bit, is similar to laid in terms of appearance and how it's used. It also has textured lines on the surface, but they are finer and more regular than those with a laid finish. Stipple papers, another one of my faves, have a raised dot pattern, kind of like tiny pebbles, but not so pronounced. And then there are deckled edges. There are smooth and textured papers that have one or more feathered edges called a deckled edge. The edges look torn. Papers with a deckled edge can give a piece a very artistic or elegant look. And then there's also recycled papers. If as part of their branding, your client wants to be perceived as environmentally friendly, a recycled paper stock would be a good option. There are papers that are FSC certified, and FSC stands for Forest Stewardship Council. FSC certification means that the paper comes from responsibly managed forests that provide environmental, social, and economic benefits. And you can use that FSC logo on a printed document, but it must have gone through the FSC, what they call chain of custody, which means from the FSC certified forest to a paper manufacturer or merchant, and then a printer who has this FSC chain of custody certification. Okay, so there's lots of factors to consider when printing on uncoated paper stocks. Earlier, I mentioned using coated paper stock when printing metallic ink, right? But you can print metallic ink on uncoated stock. It won't look shiny, but it will make for a very interesting effect on uncoated paper, almost like metallic flakes. I think it looks cool. I've done it many times. For color builds or spot colors, you definitely want to adjust them when you're printing on uncoated paper stock because the ink soaks in more and therefore appears darker. You might need to adjust the percentage of black in the color, especially if the design is printing on newsprint. And sometimes that's just as easy as reducing the black by 10% or so. You also should check color books to see if any colors will shift to a completely different color altogether. For example, and I've mentioned this quite a few times on the podcast, so you might be sick of hearing this, there are some yellow color builds and Pantone colors that appear yellow on coated paper. But when printed on uncoated paper, they actually look orange. And not only that, but some blues will look more violet when printed on uncoated paper stock. So you want to adjust the colors to prevent that. And I recommend referring to Pantone books for the CMYK builds and the Pantone colors on coated and uncoated paper stocks to ensure they will look more consistent and more as expected. You have to be really careful with photos too, adjusting the brightness and the contrast, because otherwise they could just turn to mud when they get printed. Now, if you think I'm just being picky, just think if your client is paying for ad space in a publication. That could be really expensive, like several $1,000s, tens of thousands of dollars. If you neglect to inquire about the paper type for that publication and don't make adjustments accordingly, well, the ad will likely print dark or in other colors than their brand colors or with a muddy image. And they're going to be pissed that their ad doesn't look like it should. Not only is that money wasted for your client, but it makes them look bad. If you're lucky, they'll just be mad and ask you to fix it for future ads. If you're not so lucky, they'll ask you to reimburse you for that ad placement. I mean, after all, you're the expert who should know this. All right, let's move on to paper weight. And by paper weight, I don't mean that heavy object that sits on your desk and holds papers down. In the United States, at least, paper weight is categorized by its base size, which is used to calculate the basis weight. The basis weight equals the weight of one ream, which is 500 sheets, of the base size. Now, if that's not confusing enough, the basis weights do not correspond between cover and text weights because the starting base size is not the same between paper types. So, for example, 80-pound cover is much heavier than 80-pound text, even though they both use the same number. And you refer to these paper weights by the number and the word pound like that. In paper swatch books, the samples are labeled with the color of the paper, the finish, and the weight. And by the way, you don't have to use cover stocks for covers and text weights only for text pages. And then there are also writing paper weights, and those are typically like 24-pound or 28-pound. So let's talk about some things to consider. So if the client will need to print from their office printer, paper weight will be a consideration. If it's too light or it's too thick, it will not pass through the printer well, if at all. It also may come out of the printer curled up from the heat and the roller. If the client does have a need for this, have them check their printer manual for the recommended paper weights. And then get a sample from a paper company and have the client test it by running it through their printer. I speak from experience on this. I once had a client who wanted event invitations printed in a very tiny quantity. I went schlepping around to various stores to buy the paper that I wanted, and then I needed to make sure that it would go through my own printer, which was what we were printing from. And I hadn't even thought about that until I tried to print on it, and it was too thin and it wouldn't go through the printer. Let's talk about longevity of a piece. So if you're designing a publication, you want to consider its potential lifespan. Is it a book that goes on someone's shelf that they'll refer to time and time again, which might be a long lifespan? Or is this going to be a weekly or monthly catalog, which has a much shorter lifespan? And that kind of leads us to durability, because a printed piece that needs to stick around long term should have a substantial enough cover weight and potentially a coating, such as aqueous coat or varnish, which gives added durability and even protection against fingerprints. If the book has a lot of pages, like say hundreds of pages, the cover stock also needs to be substantial enough to support its weight. On the other hand, if the paper weight of the text pages is thick and the book has hundreds of pages, it may become too heavy in general. Another thing to consider is if it will be mailed. If it's a self-mailer, such as a postcard, it has a minimum and a maximum allowed thickness, at least with the U.S. Postal Service. So it can't be too flimsy. And if it will mail in an envelope or like in a parcel, postage will be a consideration because the heavier it is, the more it will cost to mail. Now, the brightness of paper is measured by the percentage of a wavelength of blue light it reflects. The brightness ranges from 1 to 100, with 100 being the brightest. The brightness of a paper affects its readability because, like I mentioned earlier about glossy stock, it reflects more light. A brighter paper also provides for more vivid colors than papers that are lower in brightness. Opacity is a factor with paper choice too. Opacity is expressed in terms of its percentage of reflection, which is on a scale from 100% being completely opaque to 0% completely transparent. And the paper's opacity is determined by its weight, its ingredients, and absorbency. Its opacity determines how much printing will show through on the reverse side of a sheet, and that's called show through. So if there will be a lot of ink on one side of a page, like say you have a full color, full page ad, and then a page with just black text on the other side, you want to make sure there won't be too much show through so that someone can easily read the text on the page. Translucent papers have low opacity, letting some light through. These are really cool and they can provide for a really elegant effect, especially when you pair them with a bright or a dark paper, which you can see through to. These are great for invitations or a wedding program. I have an example of that on the episode page too. Okay, let's talk about paper color. If you're printing on colored paper, which could be pastel, it could be day glow, it could be metallic, well, then you need to account for the color build of the ink and of the paper. Because once that ink soaks in, it's going to mix with the paper color. So think about if you were to print blue ink on yellow paper. The blue ink is going to look more green than blue once printed. What's cool is that you can actually find out the equivalent CMYK values of the paper from the printer or paper company. The paper mill store makes it super easy to find that info for the papers that they sell. And so what you do is you subtract those values from your ink colors. So for example, if the paper is magenta 10 and yellow 20, and you want the ink to be cyan 20, magenta 40, and yellow 20. You should spec the color of the ink as C20, okay, so the same amount of cyan. And then for magenta, 30. The difference between the ink color of magenta 40 and the paper color of magenta 10. And then your yellow value would be 0 because the paper and the ink both have a yellow value of 20. So you don't need to add any yellow. You can ask the printer for what's called a drawdown and see how the ink will actually appear on that paper before it gets printed so you can see it. Ink density is a factor no matter what paper type you're using. You typically want no more than 300% of a CMYK build in any particular spot on a sheet of paper. So for example, that could be 100% cyan, 100% magenta, and 100% yellow. Those added together equal 300%. In InDesign, you would go to Window and then Output and then Separations Preview to view the color separations and set the ink limit. By default, it's already set to 300%. But if a printer ever asks you to change this number, this is where you would change it. And if you're printing on very thin paper or very absorbent paper, such as newsprint, you might need to adjust this percentage to be less. When you're looking at this ink limit in InDesign, it will show you in red the areas that you'll need to adjust. So there you have it. If you weren't aware of how paper choice affects the design process, I hope you've learned from this and are inspired to check out some of these options. If you find a paper that would be just perfect for a particular project, but the client's budget can't accommodate it, something to consider is to change the number of colors you're printing. Instead of printing 4-color process on a gloss sheet, for example, maybe you print black plus a metallic instead. Sometimes it's cheaper to get the effect you want with paper rather than with ink. Or vice versa. I mean, there are so many options. So I recommend developing a relationship with a printer and consulting with them about your ideas before you present them to the client. And that way you can make sure that they're feasible for the client's budget. After all, there's no point in getting the client's hopes up if they can't afford it. But on the other hand, you'll know what options that you have, that they might be willing to pay more for. And also because every printer stocks different brands and types of paper, they might be able to recommend something similar to one that you want to use to help keep costs down. I hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I did. I could talk about paper. I could sniff paper all day long. Do you want to get more respect and command higher rates? I can help you go from order taker to expert through mentoring, my free guides, and premium resources such as my brand style guide builder and my website accessibility course. You can find out more at creative-boost.com. You can also join me and other creatives in the Design Domination Facebook group.